In 1889, they said a woman could never be sheriff. They said Elizabeth Rogers should stick to cooking and babies. But when the Garrett gang rode into town, they learned what real courage looks like. But first, you need to understand what happened when she faced down the most corrupt sheriff in Arizona territory. The Garrett gang thought Silver Brook, Arizona, would be easy pickings. Just another sleepy frontier town with a corrupt sheriff who looked the other way. For the right price, they were wrong. Elizabeth Rogers stepped off that stagecoach on a Tuesday in 1889 with 2 small children and $43 to her name. She had no idea she'd just walked into the most dangerous town in the territory, or that in 3 weeks she'd be wearing a sheriff's badge. But what happened in the first 5 minutes changed everything. Sheriff Burns, Elizabeth's voice cut through the desert heat like a blade. I believe you were speaking to this family rather rudely. The street went dead silent. Sheriff Burns turned, his eyes cold as winter. And you are Mrs. Elizabeth Rogers, and I assume you extend the same protection to all residents, regardless of their heritage. The Mexican family behind her trembled. Children peeked from doorways. Even the horses seemed to sense danger. Burns stepped closer, close enough to smell. Whiskey on his breath, lady. You'd be wise to learn how things work around here before you start flapping your mouth. Elizabeth could have backed down, should have backed down. Any sensible widow with 2 children would have apologized and walked away. Instead, she did something that shocked the entire town. She smiled. Sheriff, I was raised to believe that a badge is meant to protect people, not intimidate them. What happened next would make Elizabeth a target for every outlaw in Arizona. Pat Collins approached, tipping his hat. The lady's right, Sheriff. Burns' face darkened like a thunder cloud. This ain't your concern. Collins, a man treating decent folks poorly, is everyone's concern. The crowd held its breath. In Silver Brook, nobody challenged Sheriff Burns. Nobody. Lived to regret it twice. 8-year-old Sarah pressed against her mother's dark dress. 6-year-old Thomas tried not to cry. They could feel the danger crackling in the air like lightning. Before a storm, but Elizabeth Rogers had buried a husband, had crossed a continent with nothing but hope, had learned that sometimes the only choice is to stand up or live on your knees. But Elizabeth had no idea Sheriff Burns was already planning her death. That night, Burns sent a telegram that would change everything. Problems with local election. Need cleanup crew for interference. The reply came within hours, arriving Saturday. GG for Garrett, the most feared outlaw gang in the territory. Comment below, would you have had the courage to stand up to a corrupt sheriff in 1889? In her small room above the general store, Elizabeth tucked her children into bed, unaware that she'd just signed their death warrant. Mama, whispered Sarah, are we safe here? Elizabeth smoothed her daughter's hair, thinking of the fear in the Mexican family's eyes, the silence of the townspeople, the cold threat in Sheriff Burns' voice. We're going to be fine. Sweetheart, she said. But outside their window, shadows moved in the darkness, because what Sheriff Burns did next would force Elizabeth to make an impossible choice. The next morning brought the news that shattered Elizabeth's world. Wexler, the kind store owner who'd promised her work, was found beaten nearly to death behind his shop. Gambling debts, Sheriff Burns claimed with a smirk. But Elizabeth had worked with Maxwell Wexler. She'd seen his careful bookkeeping, his gentle way with children, his quiet faith. This wasn't about gambling, this was about control. That afternoon, Elizabeth did something that terrified the entire town. She walked into Sheriff Burns' office and asked the questions nobody else dared ask. Sheriff Burns, I understand there's been no arrest made in Mr. Wexler's case? Burns leaned back in his chair, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. That's right. Poor old Max had some debts he couldn't pay. What kind of debts? The expensive kind. Burns stood slowly. See, Mrs. Rogers, running a business in Silver Brook requires understanding about who to pay and when and how much. The threat was clear, but Elizabeth's response would shock him. Sheriff Burns. Elizabeth said quietly, are you by any chance threatening me, ma'am? I'm just explaining how things work, friendly like. How thoughtful. And if I were to report This conversation to the territorial marshal. Burns laughed like gravel in a tin can. Lady, the nearest marshal is 3 days' ride. Lot can happen in 3 days. Elizabeth studied his face, the cold eyes, the cruel mouth, the absolute certainty that his authority was unquestionable. Then she did something that shocked him more than any defiant speech could have. She smiled and said the words that would change Silverbrook forever. Sheriff, I believe you've just convinced me that running against you isn't enough. I'm going to make sure you're not just voted out of office, I'm going to make sure you're run out of town. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that Sheriff Burns had already called in the Garrett gang. Hit that subscribe button if you believe one person can change everything. Word spread through Silverbrook faster than wildfire. Elizabeth Rogers was officially running for sheriff. The meeting that night drew half the town. Ranchers who'd ridden in from miles around, shop owners who'd closed early, Mexican families who rarely attended public gatherings. They filled every pew, lined every wall. My friends, Elizabeth began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. I stand before you not as a politician seeking power, but as a mother seeking justice. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the crowd. For too long, the people of Silverbrook have lived under a system where law enforcement serves only those who can afford protection, where honest businesses are extorted and decent families terrorized. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approval, some fear. I can't promise to solve every problem, Elizabeth continued, but I can promise this: if elected, I will serve every citizen equally, regardless of their wealth, heritage, or ability to pay unofficial taxes. But someone in that crowd was already planning Elizabeth's destruction. The young telegraph operator looked round fearfully before speaking. Mrs. Rogers, I need to tell you something about the sheriff. They stepped into the church's side room, where Billy's words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Sheriff Burns has been sending telegrams to places where the Garrett gang operates. The last one said problems with local election and need cleanup crew. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. Billy, are you certain? Yes, ma'am. And he got a reply yesterday. Just said arriving Saturday, and was signed with a G, Saturday. 3 days away. Burns wasn't just corrupt, he was actively collaborating with the territory's most feared outlaws. Elizabeth now faced an impossible choice: run for her life or stay and fight. In the darkness above the general store, Elizabeth sat watching her children sleep. Sarah's gentle breathing, Thomas's occasional murmur, the simple innocence of childhood. She thought of Samuel Martinez, lying in the cemetery with a bullet in his back. Thought of Mr. Wexler, beaten nearly to death for refusing to pay protection money. Thought of the Mexican family's terrified eyes when Burns had threatened them. There was only one choice, but first, she needed allies. The next morning, Elizabeth found Pat Collins mending fence on his ranch. Pat, she said without preamble, Sheriff Burns is bringing in the Garrett gang to eliminate his opposition. Pat's face went white. Jesus, Elizabeth, you have to leave town tonight and abandon everyone else. Let the gang turn Silverbrook into their personal hideout. She shook her head. I won't run. Elizabeth, this isn't about courage anymore. This is about survival. It's about both. What kind of mother would I be if I taught my children to run? Every time evil shows its face, Pat stared at her across the dusty yard, seeing the steel beneath the silk. All right, he said finally, if you're determined to fight, we'd better make sure you win. But the secret meeting that night would reveal an even bigger shock. Elizabeth had expected maybe a dozen supporters. Instead, she found 30 people waiting: ranchers, shop owners, even Rodriguez the blacksmith. Judge Whitmore stood to address the group. We all know why we're here. Mrs. Rogers has given us hope, but Sheriff Burns won't give up power peacefully. He outlined Billy Chen's discovery. Watching faces grow grim, the question is, do we stand together or let fear win again? We could send for the territorial marshal, Judge Whitmore suggested. 3 days ride each way, Pat replied. We don't have 6 days. The army at Fort Bowie? 5 days minimum. Elizabeth had been listening with growing certainty. Now she stood. We don't wait for outside help, she said quietly. We handle this ourselves, Elizabeth, Pat protested. You're talking about taking on the Garrett gang. These aren't local bullies, they're professional killers. I'm talking about being ready when they come. About not letting them terrorize this town the way Burns has. Elizabeth's plan was so dangerous, even her supporters thought she'd lost her mind. Here's what we're going to do, Elizabeth continued. When the gang arrives, they'll expect to find a frightened town full of easy targets. Instead, they're going to find something they've never faced before. What's that? Asked Henderson. Elizabeth's smile was steel wrapped in silk. A sheriff who actually serves the people, one by one, despite their fear. The townspeople joined her plan because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up to remind others they have spines too. Subscribe if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together. Saturday dawned clear and hot, with the kind of stillness that comes before violent storms. In Silverbrook, preparations had been made, but not the kind Sheriff Burns expected. Mrs. Chen positioned herself at the church bell tower there. Agreed. Signal. Rodriguez checked the rifles hidden behind his forge. Judge Whitmore ensured the jail cell doors would open from the inside. And Elizabeth Rogers pinned on the badge the town council had hastily authorized, becoming the first female sheriff in Arizona territory. But none of them knew the Garrett gang was already watching. 5 riders sat their horses in the morning shadows, studying Silverbrook through field glasses. Jack Garrett, leader of the territory's most feared outlaw band, lowered his spyglass with a cold smile. Burns said it would be easy. He told his men, one woman causing trouble should be over in an hour. What Garrett didn't know was that one woman had spent 3 days turning a terrified town into a united force. What he didn't know was that Elizabeth Rogers had been preparing for this moment her entire life. What he didn't know was that he was about to face something the Old West had never seen before. A sheriff who fought for justice instead of profit. The first chime echoed across Silverbrook at exactly 10 a.m. Mrs. Chen had spotted the riders. Shop doors locked. Children disappeared into back rooms. Men took positions behind windows and water troughs. In 30 seconds, Silverbrook's main street was empty except for tumbleweeds and tension. Sheriff Elizabeth Rogers walked into the street wearing a simple brown dress, her late husband's gun belt, and a badge that caught the morning sun like a star. Behind her came Pat Collins, Rodriguez, and Judge Whitmore. Not many, but enough. What happened next would be talked about for 50 years. The Garrett gang rode down Main Street like harbingers of hell. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves. Spurs jingled like death rattles. They expected to find Sheriff Burns waiting with a frightened woman in chains. Instead, they found Elizabeth Rogers standing in the middle of the street, calm as Sunday morning. You boys lost, Elizabeth called out, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Jack Garrett's horse pranced sideways, sensing its rider's surprise. This wasn't what Burns had promised. Where's Sheriff Burns? Garrett demanded. Relieved of duty, Elizabeth replied. I'm Sheriff Rogers now, and you're trespassing. Garrett's laugh was ugly. Lady, you got no idea who you're talking to. Jack Garrett, Elizabeth said calmly. Wanted for robbery, rustling, and murder in 4 territories. Bounty of $500, dead or alive. The outlaws exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to plan. But Garrett had one card left to play, and it was Elizabeth's worst nightmare. Garrett. Sheriff Burns stepped into the street, badge still on his chest, corruption written on his face. What took you so long? The pieces clicked into place. Burns hadn't been relieved he'd been hiding, waiting for his hired guns. Change of plan, Burns called out. The woman's got the whole town stirred up. We clean out the troublemakers, then things go back to normal. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Her children were watching from the general store window. Sarah's small hand pressed against the glass. This had become about more than justice. This was about protecting everything she loved. Garrett, Elizabeth called out, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who'd found her true calling. You have one chance to ride out of here. Take it. Garrett's sneer widened. Or what? You gonna arrest all 5 of us? Elizabeth's hand rested easily on her gun. If necessary. Lady, I've killed better men than you. Maybe, Elizabeth replied. But you've never killed anyone fighting for their children. What happened next took 30 seconds and changed the West forever. Garrett went for his gun. Elizabeth was faster. His men scattered as rifle fire erupted from windows and doorways. The townspeople had kept their word. They stood with their sheriff. Rodriguez's shot knocked a rider from his horse. Pat Collins tackled another as he tried to escape. Judge Whitmore, despite his age, helped corner a third, Mrs. Chen's church. Bell kept ringing, calling everyone to witness. When the gun smoke cleared, 3 outlaws lay dead. 2 more sat in the dirt with their hands up, blood trickling from wounds. And Elizabeth Rogers stood in the middle of Main Street, badge still gleaming, having just won the most important battle in Silverbrook's history. But there was one more. Surprise waiting. Burns had used the confusion to slip toward his horse. Now he mounted up, desperate to flee before the territorial marshal arrived. But as he wheeled his horse around, he found his path blocked, not by men with guns, by women with determination. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Patterson, Judge Whitmore's wife, Mrs. Santos, a dozen more, the women of Silverbrook, standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking Burns' escape. Going somewhere, Sheriff? Mrs. Chen asked quietly. For the first time in years, Buck Burns looked afraid. Behind him stood the new sheriff and her deputies. In front of him stood the women he'd terrorized for too long. There was nowhere left to run. Elizabeth approached Burns' horse, her gun drawn, but pointed down. Sheriff Burns, she said formally, you're under arrest for corruption, extortion, conspiracy with known criminals, and accessory to murder. Burns' face twisted with rage. You think this changes anything? There'll be others. There's always others. Elizabeth looked around at the faces surrounding them, men and women who'd found their courage, children who would grow up in a better world. You're right, she said. There will always be people like you, but now there'll be people like us to stop them. Share this story if you believe courage is contagious. 3 months later, Silverbrook looked like a different town. The same buildings, the same desert, the same mountains in the distance. But something fundamental had changed. Hope had returned. Mexican families shopped freely on Main Street. Children played without fear. New businesses opened their doors. The church rang its bell for celebrations, not warnings. Sheriff Elizabeth Rogers sat at her desk, reviewing reports and correspondence. Real law enforcement work, not the collection of protection money that had passed for justice under Burns. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Pat Collins entered, carrying a telegram and wearing the smile that had become familiar over the past months. Official word from the territorial capital, he said, handing her the paper. Your appointment as sheriff has been confirmed by the governor. Congratulations, Sheriff Rogers. Elizabeth read the telegram twice, still hardly believing it was real. You know, she said softly, when I stepped off that stagecoach, all I wanted was a job and a safe place to raise my children. And now you're the most famous sheriff in Arizona territory. Pat replied, there's been newspaper articles from Phoenix to Tucson. They're calling you the petticoat sheriff. Elizabeth made a face. I prefer Sheriff Rogers, thank you very much. Pat laughed, then grew more serious. Elizabeth, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. She looked up from the telegram, noting the nervous tension in his voice. I know this might not be the right time, and I know you've got your hands full with being sheriff and raising your children, but he paused, gathering courage. Would you consider having dinner with me? Not as the sheriff and a concerned citizen, but as Elizabeth and Pat. Elizabeth smiled, the first truly relaxed smile she'd allowed herself in months. Pat Collins, are you asking to court the sheriff? I'm asking to court the woman, he replied. The sheriff just happens to come with the package. In that case, Elizabeth said, I'd be honored. That evening, the town held an impromptu celebration in the church social hall. Nothing fancy, just neighbors gathering to share food and fellowship, celebrating the kind of normalcy they'd almost forgotten was possible. Elizabeth sat with Sarah and Thomas, watching her children laugh and play with other kids their age. For the first time since her husband's death, they looked truly happy. Mama, Sarah asked, tugging on Elizabeth's sleeve. Why did you become sheriff? Weren't you scared? Elizabeth considered the question carefully. Her daughter deserved an honest answer. I was terrified, sweetheart. But I realized that being scared and being brave aren't opposites. Sometimes being brave means doing what's right, even when you're scared. Is that why Daddy went to war? The question pierced Elizabeth's heart, but she nodded. Your daddy fought for what he believed in, just like we did here. Thomas, who'd been listening intently, spoke up. Are the bad men going to come back? Maybe. Elizabeth replied honestly. But if they do, we'll be ready. And more importantly, we'll be together. Judge Whitmore stood to address the gathering. Friends, 6 months ago, Silverbrook was a town living in fear. Tonight, we're a community living in hope. And we have Sheriff Rogers to thank for that. Applause filled the small hall, but Elizabeth raised her hand. Judge Whitmore, with respect. You're wrong. We don't have me to thank. We have us to thank. Every person who signed that petition, every family that stood up to corruption, every neighbor who chose courage over comfort. That's what changed Silverbrook. She stood, looking around at the faces that had become dear to her. I learned something important here. Evil thrives when good people stay silent. But when ordinary folks decide they've had enough, when they choose to stand together instead of standing aside, there's no force on earth that can stop them. Mrs. Chen raised her hand. Sheriff, what's next for Silverbrook? Elizabeth smiled. What's next is what we build together. Better schools for our children, fair treatment for all families, a place where the law protects everyone equally, and new challenges. Pat added. The territory's changing fast. There'll be new problems to solve. Then we'll solve them, Elizabeth replied simply. Together, as the evening wound down, Elizabeth watched the children of Silverbrook playing together, Anglo and Mexican, ranch kids and town kids, all of them safe and free in a way that had seemed impossible just months before. That's when she knew with absolute certainty that everything had been worth it. Later that night, after tucking Sarah and Thomas into their beds in the small house that came with the sheriff's job, Elizabeth sat on her front porch looking up at the stars. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach, frightened, alone, desperate for security. That woman had been looking for safety. Instead, she'd found purpose. Thank you, she whispered to the desert night, to her late husband's memory, to whatever divine providence had brought her to this place at this time. The wind whispered back through the cottonwoods, and Elizabeth could almost hear her husband's voice. You did good, Lizzie. You did real good. As if summoned by her moment of peace, the sound of approaching horses broke the desert silence. Elizabeth tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward her gun. Then she heard voices, familiar voices. Sheriff Rogers. It was Rodriguez, accompanied by 2 of his ranch hands. Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got a situation. What kind of situation? Cattle rustlers hit the Morrison Ranch tonight, made off with about 50 head. But here's the thing, they left a message carved into the barn door. Elizabeth's stomach tightened. What did it say? The Garrett gang sends their regards. Elizabeth stood slowly, her peaceful evening shattered, but her resolve unshaken. Rodriguez, round up Pat Collins and Judge Whitmore. Wake them if you have to. She checked her gun, her movements automatic and confident. And send word to the territorial marshal. Tell him Sheriff Rogers requests assistance with a gang of cattle thieves. As Rodriguez rode off to gather help, Elizabeth looked back at her sleeping children, then at the town she'd sworn to protect. The Garrett gang was finished, but apparently their reputation lived on. Copycat criminals, thinking they could terrorize Silverbrook the way Burns once had. They were about to learn the same lesson Jack Garrett had learned. Elizabeth Rogers wasn't just a sheriff. She was a mother defending her family, a woman protecting her community, a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that things can't be changed. As she rode toward the Morrison Ranch, backup gathering behind her, Elizabeth Rogers carried with her the knowledge that had transformed her from a desperate widow into a legendary lawwoman. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to back down. Hit subscribe if you believe one person can change the world. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Elizabeth's place? Thanks for spending time with us today. If this story of courage and faith meant something to you, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls, real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.